In 1921, a psychologist walked into California classrooms with a test that had never been used this way before, looking for children he believed were destined for greatness. He found roughly 1,500 of them, all with IQ scores above 135, some well above 150, and he set out to track their entire lives to prove a simple, confident theory that genius, once identified early, would inevitably produce genius. He was going to track these children for the rest of his life, and in a strange twist neither he nor anyone else could have predicted, researchers are still studying parts of this data today, nearly 80 years after the last children in the study grew old and passed away. It remains the longest-running psychological study ever conducted on a single group of people, a scientific relay race passed from researcher to researcher across 4 generations, all built around one simple question: does being a genius as a child guarantee a genius life? But here's the detail that makes this story truly remarkable, and one that most people have never heard. 2 children were tested for this exact study. Both scored just below the cutoff. Both were rejected. Both later grew up to win the Nobel Prize. Meanwhile, among the 1,500 children who were accepted into the study, not a single one ever won a Nobel Prize. This is the story of Terman's termites, and what it actually reveals about intelligence is far stranger, far more human, and far more useful than anyone expected in 1921. The psychologist behind this study was Lewis Terman, a professor at Stanford University who had recently revised an earlier French intelligence test into what became known as the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale. This test would go on to shape how intelligence has been measured for more than a century. Terman believed intelligence was the single most important human trait, more important than character, more important than opportunity, and more important than luck. At the time, many people believed that gifted children were weak, socially awkward, unhealthy, and likely to burn out early. This stereotype was known as the early ripe, early rot myth. Terman wanted to prove that belief wrong using scientific evidence. So, in 1921, he and his research team began what became known as the genetic studies of genius. Teachers across California were asked to nominate the brightest students in their schools. Those students were given IQ tests, and only children with scores of 135 or higher were selected. Some even scored well above 150. Over time, these children became known as Terman's termites. Terman was not a distant scientist watching from the sidelines. He became deeply involved in the project. He had grown up in rural Indiana as one of 14 children and had spent years wondering what separated ordinary minds from extraordinary ones. Before launching this study, he had already adapted Alfred Binet's original intelligence test. Binet designed his test to identify children who needed extra educational support. Terman transformed it into a tool for identifying exceptionally gifted children. He believed intelligence testing could reveal a person's future potential, and this belief shaped both the ambition and the limitations of his life's work. The earliest results seemed to confirm everything Terman had hoped for. Contrary to the stereotype, the children were taller, healthier, and more socially adjusted than average. They performed well in school, showed strong emotional stability, and were generally liked by their classmates. For Terman, this was clear proof that the myth of the fragile genius was false. But childhood would prove to be the easiest part of the study to understand. Adulthood would become much more complicated. It is also important to understand how detailed this early research really was. The team did not simply measure IQ once and walk away. They collected information about the children's physical health, family background, hobbies, friendships, and personality. Teachers and parents rated qualities such as persistence, self-confidence, honesty, and responsibility long before personality psychology became a formal scientific field. At the time, nobody realized these personality ratings would eventually become more important than the IQ scores themselves. Before following the children into adulthood, there is one story that deserves attention because it became one of the greatest ironies in the history of psychology. During the selection process, 2 boys scored just below the required IQ level. Their names were William Shockley and Luis Alvarez. Both were excluded from the study because they narrowly missed the cutoff. Years later, William Shockley helped invent the transistor, a technology that powers almost every modern electronic device, and won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956. Luis Alvarez also built an extraordinary scientific career, contributed to important wartime research, won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1968, and later became famous for developing the asteroid impact theory explaining the extinction of the dinosaurs with his son. Two rejected children won Nobel Prizes, while none of the 1,500 carefully selected gifted children did. This does not mean IQ tests are useless, and it does not mean the children in the study lacked intelligence. What it clearly shows is that a single IQ score measured on one day in childhood can never capture everything that eventually leads to extraordinary achievement. The rest of Terman's study would continue to reveal exactly why. There is another layer to this irony that makes the story even more complicated. William Shockley later became one of the most controversial figures in modern science. Beyond his Nobel Prize-winning work on the transistor, he publicly promoted ideas about race and intelligence that were widely rejected by the scientific community. Ironically, the boy who had been rejected from a study shaped by beliefs about intelligence later became associated with many of those same harmful ideas. History rarely gives us simple lessons, and this story is no exception. So what actually happened to the 1,500 children who were accepted into the study? The honest answer is that most of them lived successful, stable, and productive lives, but very few became world-changing figures. As a group, they earned university degrees at far higher rates than the average population. Many became doctors, lawyers, professors, engineers, business leaders, and scientists. They generally earned good incomes, enjoyed stable family lives, and achieved professional success. In that sense, Terman was partly correct. High intelligence did increase the chances of positive life outcomes. But Terman had expected much more than above-average success. He believed these children would become the greatest thinkers, inventors, and leaders of their generation. He imagined a future filled with Nobel Prize winners, groundbreaking scientists, and internationally famous innovators. That vision never became reality. Most of the children lived respectable, comfortable, and meaningful lives, but they remained ordinary by historical standards. They built careers, raised families, contributed to society, and retired without becoming household names. Some members of the study did reach impressive positions. A few became respected university professors, senior executives, successful researchers, and influential public servants. Yet when later researchers searched for one individual who truly changed the course of history, they found no clear example. In a surprising way, the most famous result of the entire project became the study itself, rather than any of the people inside it. There was also a more difficult side to the findings. Not every gifted child followed the path Terman expected. Some never completed college despite their exceptionally high IQ scores. Others struggled to maintain stable careers. Several developed serious problems with alcohol, and over the decades, there were confirmed suicides among the participants. These painful outcomes showed that intelligence alone could not protect anyone from the emotional struggles, personal losses, and unexpected hardships that are part of being human. For Terman, these results were deeply disappointing. He had spent decades building relationships with many of the children, exchanging letters, following their careers, and celebrating their achievements. Over time, he became more than a researcher. He became a mentor who genuinely cared about the people he had selected. Watching some of them struggle challenged the belief that intelligence guaranteed success. Hidden within the later records of the project was another revealing detail. Terman reportedly kept a private, unofficial list of participants whom he believed had not lived up to their intellectual potential. These were individuals whose careers seemed ordinary compared with the extraordinary promise suggested by their childhood test scores. That private list reveals how personal the study had become for him. What had started as a scientific investigation slowly turned into a lifelong test of his own beliefs about intelligence and human potential. Many of the participants later reflected on the experience of being labeled gifted from such a young age. For some, the label became a source of confidence, motivation, and pride. For others, it became a lifelong burden. They felt constant pressure to prove they deserved the title of genius and worried they would disappoint everyone if their lives turned out to be ordinary. The study unintentionally showed that expectations themselves can shape a person's experience just as much as natural ability. When Lewis Terman died in 1956, the project did not end. His colleagues continued following the participants, and later generations of psychologists carried the research forward. This decision transformed the project into one of the longest-running studies ever conducted. Decades later, researchers returned to the original records with completely different questions than Terman had asked. Instead of wondering whether IQ predicted success, they asked something far more important. What actually predicts a long, healthy, and fulfilling life? The answer would completely change the meaning of the study. Instead of intelligence, another characteristic quietly emerged as one of the strongest predictors of long-term success and longevity. It was not raw IQ, but something far less glamorous and far more practical. The researchers discovered that the seeds of this answer had been sitting inside Terman's original data all along, waiting for someone to ask the right question. In the 1990s and early 2000s, psychologists Howard Friedman and Leslie Martin returned to Terman's original records with a completely different perspective. Their work later became the foundation of the book The Longevity Project. Instead of asking whether high IQ predicted success, they wanted to know what predicted a longer, healthier life. The answer surprised almost everyone. Intelligence itself showed very little connection with lifespan. The strongest predictor turned out to be a personality trait called conscientiousness. Children who were organized, responsible, dependable, careful, and self-disciplined tended to live longer, healthier lives than children with equal or even higher IQ scores who lacked those qualities. Their research uncovered even more unexpected patterns. Certain childhood experiences, such as family instability and parental divorce, were associated with shorter lifespans many decades later. They also found that happiness was far more complicated than people assumed. Contrary to the popular belief that cheerful, carefree children lived the healthiest lives, the data suggested that children who were thoughtful, cautious, and responsible often experience better long-term health outcomes. These findings had been hidden inside the original data for decades, simply waiting for researchers to ask different questions. At the same time, it is impossible to tell the story of Terman's study honestly without discussing the darker side of his legacy. Lewis Terman strongly supported the eugenics movement, a set of beliefs that claimed intelligence determined human worth, and that society should control who was allowed to have children based on supposed genetic superiority. Today, these ideas are recognized as scientifically false and morally harmful. Intelligence testing was often misused during that period to justify discrimination, forced sterilization, and unfair immigration policies. The study itself also reflected the limitations of its time. Teachers selected the children during an era of significant racial and economic inequality. As a result, most participants came from white middle-class and upper-middle-class families in California. The sample did not represent the full diversity of society, which limits how widely the findings can be applied. Terman also worked alongside broader efforts that promoted intelligence testing as a way of identifying people considered mentally superior or inferior. Although these views were common among many scientists of that era, history has shown how dangerous they became when combined with public policy. Recognizing this context does not erase the scientific value of the study, but it reminds us that even important research can be influenced by the personal beliefs and biases of the people conducting it. So, after following these children for nearly 80 years, what did this extraordinary study actually teach us? It showed that intelligence, measured by a single childhood test, is not a guarantee of future greatness. A high IQ can provide an important advantage, but it is only one part of a much larger picture. Qualities such as responsibility, persistence, emotional stability, supportive relationships, and consistent effort often matter just as much, and sometimes even more than raw intellectual ability. The study also reminds us that human potential cannot be reduced to a single number. Two children who missed the IQ cutoff went on to reshape modern physics, while many children with much higher scores lived ordinary but meaningful lives. Intelligence opened doors, but it did not determine destiny. Success turned out to depend on countless factors that no single test could ever measure. Perhaps the greatest lesson of Terman's Termites is not about IQ at all. It is about the danger of believing that any single measurement can fully predict a human life. People grow in unexpected ways, opportunities appear without warning, and determination, character, relationships, and resilience often shape the future more than talent alone. If this story surprised you, let us know in the comments what you found most fascinating. Was it the rejected Nobel Prize winners, the discoveries about conscientiousness, or the complicated legacy of Lewis Terman himself? And if you enjoy exploring the real history behind psychology's most influential studies, make sure to subscribe because there are many more remarkable stories waiting to be uncovered.